You can see on the screen that the title of our study today is The Sword and the Captivity. We're going to do a little review of what we studied in the first two sessions, and then we will enter new material. But before we do, we want to ask for the Lord's presence. Never should we open God's Word without prayer. And so I invite you to bow your heads reverently with me as we pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for the privilege of being here. We especially thank you for your Word, which is a sure guide in a world that is so confused. We ask, Father, that you will speak to us through this Word. Give us understanding and a willingness to live in harmony with what you reveal to us. Remove from our hearts any obstacle, anything that might keep us from hearing your voice, for we want to do your will. And we ask this in the precious name of Jesus. Amen. The title of this presentation is The Sword and the Captivity. And what we want to do first is a review of what we have studied so far. We're studying the chain of prophetic prophecy. We began with which kingdom? Those of you who have been here? We begin with Babylon, 605 to 539 BC. Then we continue with the second kingdom. What is that second kingdom? Medo-Persia, 539 to 331 BC. Then we have a third kingdom, which is what? Greece. And Greece ruled from 331 BC to 168 BC. And then we have a fourth beast, which is dreadful and terrible, and this fourth beast represents which kingdom? It represents the Roman Empire. But then, this beast, after it rules for a significant amount of time, sprouts 10 horns. That means that the Roman Empire was going to be what? Was going to be divided. And it was divided. The nations of Europe today are the fruit of the division of the Roman Empire. They each have their language, their culture, and it's been very difficult to try and get them together, no matter how much the European Union has tried to stay together, because these nations are totally different from one another. And then after the Roman Empire is divided into these 10 kingdoms, which are the nations of Western Europe, then in the midst of the 10 rises what? A little horn. And that little horn rules from 538 to 1798 AD, 1,260 years we're going to see in our study today. So is the sequence clear? We've gone from Babylon, from 605 BC, all the way down to 1798 in the prophetic chain, without any interruptions, no parentheses, one kingdom rising as soon as the previous kingdom falls. In other words, there is a sequence of connected links in the prophetic chain. Now, in our last study together, we talked about the little horn, and we gave 7 characteristics of the little horn. I want to review the first 6 characteristics, and then we will study characteristic number 7, which we left pending for this particular lecture today. And so I want to review the 6 points that we studied in our lecture last time. Number 1, the little horn rises, according to prophecy, after the 10 horns are in place. Let me ask you, when is it the 10 horns are in place? In what year? The year 476 AD, the 10 kingdoms are there. So we should expect the little horn to rise after the year 476. Secondly, the little horn rises in the midst of the 10. Now the 10 represent the nations of Western Europe. So this little horn must rise where? Geographically in Western Europe. But more specifically, the little horn rises from the head of the dragon beast, which represents Rome. So the little horn must also be what? It must also be Roman, more specifically. Characteristic number 3, this horn would uproot 3 kingdoms. 3 of the 10 kingdoms into which the empire was divided would be uprooted by this little horn. And then we noticed that this little horn would speak blasphemies against the Most High. And we identified blasphemy as a human power that claims that it can forgive sins and claims to be God's representative on earth. Then we noticed that the little horn also would persecute the saints of the Most High. In other words, the little horn would persecute those who remain faithful to God. And then we noticed also that the little horn would think that it can change God's holy law in some way or some manner. Now let me ask you, does the Roman Catholic papacy fulfill each and every one of these characteristics? It does. Does the Roman Catholic papacy rise after 476? Yes. Did it rise in Western Europe, more specifically in Rome? Absolutely. Did it uproot 3 of those 10 kingdoms? Yes. The Heruli, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths. Does it speak blasphemies against the Most High? Does the papacy claim to have the power to forgive sins? Do they claim that the Pope is the representative of Christ on earth? Absolutely. Let me ask you, did the papacy in its history persecute the faithful of God through the Inquisition and many other methods? Absolutely. Does the papacy claim to have changed God's holy law? Yes, the papacy openly says, we changed the day of worship from Sabbath to Sunday without any biblical authorization. They say Jesus gave the Roman Catholic Church the power to change the law if it saw necessary to do so. And so the little horn represents the papacy. Now, before we deal with characteristic number 7, which is the time period that the little horn rules, I need to underline something that is very, very important. And that is that the little horn of Daniel 7 is the same as the beast of Revelation 13, 1 through 10. So little horn and beast are interchangeable. And you say, how do you know that? For 3 reasons. First of all, the little horn and the beast are in the same link of the prophetic chain. They're in the same location of the prophetic chain. Number 2, the little horn and the beast perform the same activities. And number 3, the little horn and the beast rule for the same time period. So we have 3 reasons why we know that the little horn and the beast represent the same power. They are in the exact same location in the prophetic chain. Secondly, they perform the same actions. And in the third place, they rule for the same time period. And you're saying, well, where does prophecy tell us that? Well, now we need to look at what the Bible says about this. Let's notice Revelation chapter 13 and verses 1 and 2. This is the first reason why the little horn is the same thing as the beast. And immediately in Revelation 13, 1 and 2, you're going to see a connection with the prophecy of Daniel 7 that we studied. Notice what it says there in Revelation 13, verses 1 and 2. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, writes John, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now listen to verse 2. Now the beast that I saw was like a what? Like a leopard. And its feet were like the feet of a bear. And its mouth was like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power, his throne, and great authority. How many beasts are mentioned in this verse 2? 4. Is there a lion? Yes. Is there a bear? Absolutely. Is there a leopard? Sure. Is there a dragon beast? And by the way, the dragon beast has 10 horns, according to Revelation chapter 12. So what I want you to see here is that we have the same sequence in Revelation 13 that we have in Daniel 7. The only difference is that in Revelation chapter 13, the beasts are in reverse order. In other words, they're not in the same order as in Daniel. In Daniel, you have lion, bear, leopard, dragon, 10 horns, and little horn. In Revelation chapter 13, you have, in reverse order, you have the 10-horned dragon, and then you have the leopard, and then you have the bear, and then you have the lion. Now the question is, why does Daniel present the beasts, lion, bear, leopard, dragon, 10 horns, and little horn? And in Revelation 13, John presents this as being in the opposite direction. The reason is very simple. Daniel is living in the period of the lion, and he's looking forwards. Whereas John is living in the period of the dragon, and he is looking what? He is looking backwards. So we know that the prophetic chain is true because you have the same sequence, but in Revelation it's in reverse order because John is living in the period of the fourth beast and the first three beasts have already passed away. Are you with me or not? So let me ask you, is the little horn and is the beast in the same location of the prophetic chain? Let me review it. Lion, bear, leopard, dragon, 10 horns, little horn. Revelation 13, lion, bear, leopard, dragon, 10 horns, beast. So the little horn and the beast are in the same location of the prophetic chain. The second reason that I mentioned is that the little horn and the beast perform the same actions. Notice Revelation chapter 13, and we'll read verse 7, and then we will read verse 5. Revelation 13:7 says, "It was granted to him," this is the beast, the same as the little horn, "to make war with the saints and to overcome them." Let me ask you, did the little horn make war with the saints and overcome them in Daniel chapter 7? Absolutely, but there's more. It says, "An authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation." And now notice verse 5. "And he was given," that is, the beast, "was given a mouth." Did the little horn have a big mouth? You can read it in Daniel 7. It says he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. Did the little horn speak great things and blasphemies? So let me ask you, do the little horn and the beast perform the same actions? Yes, so they must represent the same power. Now, number 3 is that the beast and the little horn rule for the same time period. Notice Revelation chapter 13 and verse 5. We'll complete reading the verse now. It says, "And he," that is the beast, "was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue how long? To continue for 42 months. And I know you're thinking, you're saying, "Pastor, that's not the same time period." Because in Daniel 7, it says the little horn ruled for time, times, and the dividing of time, whereas in Revelation 13, it says the beast ruled for 42 months. How can time, times, and the dividing of time be the same as 42 months? This brings us to characteristic number 7 that we left pending in our last lecture. Now, what I want us to notice, first of all, is that the word time in the book of Daniel refers to year. Time is a year. You say, well, how do you know that? Very simple. You remember in Daniel chapter 4 that Nebuchadnezzar was out of it for a while? How much time was going to pass for Nebuchadnezzar before he regained his senses? The angel said 7 times will pass over you. What did that mean, 7 times we're going to pass over Nebuchadnezzar? It means that he was going to be out of it for how long? 7 years. So the word time or times refers to what? Years. That's the first point that we want to notice. And by the way, time, times, and the dividing of time would be how many years? It would be 3.5. Time, 1 year. Times without a qualifier is the dual in Hebrew. That's 2. And half a time would be half a year. So we're dealing with 3.5 years. And there's no Bible scholar that disagrees that these are 3.5 years. The time, times, and the dividing of times are 3.5 years. Doesn't matter what denomination they belong to. Now, the big question is, are these literal years or are these symbolic years? That's the big question. Well, there are several evidences that we're dealing with symbolic years. The first reason why these years are symbolic is because everything in Daniel chapter 7 is symbolic. Let me ask you, is the lion symbolic? Are the wings on the lion symbolic? Is the bear symbolic? Are the 3 ribs in the mouth of the bear symbolic? Is the leopard symbolic? Are the wings of the leopard symbolic? Are the 4 heads of the leopard symbolic? Is the dragon beast symbolic? Last I knew, there's no dragon beast that exists in the real world. Are the 10 horns on the head of the 4th beast symbolic? Yes, everything in this chapter is symbolic, but the time is literal. Now, how much sense does that make? Now, you'll notice also that the expression has a symbolic flavor to it. If I was going to leave Fresno and return in 3.5 years, would I say to you, folks, don't worry, I'll be back in time, times, and the dividing of time? If I said that, you would say, Pastor Bohr, that's not the way that we describe time. When the Bible wants to describe 3.5 literal years, it does so like in James chapter 5:17, where it says that Elijah closed the heavens so it would not rain for 3 years and 6 months. That's the normal way of expressing it. And the Bible expresses it that way in James chapter 5 and verse 17. So the flavor of the expression is unusual. Another important point is, and by the way, I don't have time to go through all of this. It would take me actually 3 hours to go through a document that I wrote for one of our summits a few years ago, where I present 20 biblical reasons for the year-day principle. In other words, 20 reasons why the years of Daniel chapter 7 are symbolic years. And in a moment, we're going to talk about what is known as the year-day principle. So there's not only one reason why we can understand that this time period is symbolic. There are 20 reasons in the Bible why we can believe that time, times, and the dividing of time is symbolic language. You see, the Bible uses what is known as the year-day principle. In other words, a day is equivalent to a year. You say, now where do you find such a thing in the Bible? As I mentioned, I gave 20 reasons, but I'm only going to mention a couple of verses that the Bible has about this. Do you remember when the spies were sent out to spy out the land? And 10 of them brought back a bad report, and 2 of them brought back a good report. So what did God tell Israel? Because the spies were in the land for 40 days, and because you're rebellious, you are going to be in the wilderness how long? You're going to be in the wilderness 40 years. He says, for each day, what? 1 year. There you have the day representing what? A year. By the way, that is in Numbers chapter 14 and verse 34. Also in Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 6, we find the same principle expressed. I want to read that verse. I wish we had time to expound upon the historical context, but we don't. Ezekiel 4 verse 6. And when, he's speaking to Ezekiel, and when you have accomplished them, lie again on your right side, and you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed you each day for what? Each day for a year. So what we need to understand is that in the Bible, 1 day is equal to what? To a year. Now here's the big question. Can we know how many days there are in a year? Because we're dealing with 3.5 years. So we need to find out how many days are 3.5 years. Are you with me? And then apply them symbolically. Can we know biblically how many days the year had? And the answer is no. We don't have any place in the Bible that tells us that the year has 360 days. So you say, Pastor Bohr, how can we find out how many days is 3.5 years if the Bible doesn't tell us how many days are in a year? Well, the good news is that the Bible does tell us that there are 12 months in the year. You can find that in the book of Esther, chapter 8 and verse 12. And the Bible also tells us that each month has 30 days. So if each month has 30 days, what do you do to find out how many days the year has? All you have to do is multiply 12 months, which the Bible says there are 12 months to the year, by how much? By 30 days, and the result is what? 360. So by knowing the number of days in the month, we can find out how many days there are in a what? In a year. Are you with me so far? Now, but you're saying, Pastor Bohr, you haven't proved that the biblical month has 30 days. And you're right. And that's the point that we're going to go to now. We're going to prove biblically that the biblical month has 30 days. If the biblical month has 30 days, all you have to do is multiply 30 times 12 months of the year, and the result is 360. And because you have time, that's 1 year, 360 days, times, that's 2 years, 720 days, and half a time, 180 days, that would be how long? Time times and the dividing of time. It would be 1,260 days, but in prophecy, days are equal to years. Are you following me or not? This is a very short lesson on math, and some people find it very complicated to be able to figure it out, but it's not really that complicated. Now, what is the first reason we can know that the biblical month has 30 days? Well, the fact is that this period of the little horn is expressed in 3 different ways. It is expressed as time, times, and the dividing of time. That's in Daniel chapter 7, and also in Revelation chapter 12. It is expressed as 42 months in Revelation 11, which we're not going to get into, also in Revelation 13, verse 5 that we read. And it is also described in Revelation 12 as 1,260 days. Now, this is interesting. Now, let me ask you this. If you multiply 42 months, and how many days do the months have? 30 days. Okay, if you multiply 42 months times 30 days, what is the total? 1,260. If you multiply 3.5 years times 360 days per year, what is the total? 1,260 days. And if you still didn't get it, in Revelation chapter 12, it says that the dragon went after the woman and persecuted the woman for 1,260 days. So how many days does the biblical month have? The biblical month has to have 30 days, because 30 days times 42 months is 1,260. So how long was the little horn going to rule? It was going to rule from its inception till the time when it ceased to rule, 1,260 what? 1,260 days, but days are equal to years. The papacy was to rule from 538 to 1798, and we'll talk a little bit about what happened in 1798 in a few moments. There's a second reason why we know that the biblical month has 30 days. And this is early in the Bible. This is in the book of Genesis from the very beginning. Go with me to Genesis chapter 7, verses 11 and 12. Genesis 7, 11 and 12. I want you to notice this carefully. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, what day? The 17th day of the month. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. So when did the flood come? The flood came in the 600th year of Noah's life, the 2nd month, and the 17th day. Remember that date, okay? Now let's go to Genesis 8, verses 3 to 5. Genesis 8, 3 to 5. See, this is all fine in the Bible. We're not just guessing. We're not conjecturing. You know, we're letting the Bible explain itself. The Holy Spirit put in the Bible everything we need to understand the Bible. You know, the Holy Spirit didn't make pastors and theologians necessary. Absolutely indispensable. You know, I'm not saying that theologians and pastors are unnecessary. What I'm saying is that if we didn't have them, we could still determine what is God's will from the Word. Now, notice what it says in Genesis 8, 3 to 5. And the waters receded continually. That's from the time that the flood began. And the waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. Then the ark rested in the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. Did you notice that there's something interesting in these two verses, these two passages? When did the flood come? Month number 2, day 17, 600th year. When did the waters recede? After how many days? 150 days. What date was the date that is given for the receding of the waters? The 7th month, the 17th day, the 600th year of Noah's life. How many months between the 2nd month and the 7th month? 5. And how many days is that? 150. So you divide 150 by 5, and lo and behold, what do you get? 30. Each month has what? 30 days. Are you with me? Now, I'm not here to give you a math lesson, but all of these things are important to understand this prophecy. Now we need to talk about the ending point of the dominion of the papacy. Something must have happened in the year 1798 that took away power from the papacy, that ended the papacy's period of dominion. Let's review the 3 stages of the 4th beast. First of all, we have the dragon ruling by itself. Do you remember that? The dragon beast represents the Roman Empire. For most of its career, the Roman Empire was one empire. It was united. Then, when you reach the year 476, the Roman Empire has been divided into what? Into 10 kingdoms. Those are the 10 horns. And then the little horn rises in 538, as we noticed. The last horn, the last rebellious horn, the Ostrogoths, was uprooted, and now the papacy had sovereign power because it had no opposition from any of these kingdoms. And so in 538, the papacy begins its rule, so we would have to go to what date to find the ending point of the 1260 years? All you have to do is go from 538, 1,260 years forward, and that takes you to what year? It takes you to the year 1798. And you say, Pastor Bohr, did anything significant happen in 1798? Listen carefully to what I'm going to say. The papacy began its rule when the last of the rebellious kingdoms was uprooted. That was in 538, the Ostrogoths. And we know it was in the month of February of 538. So you would expect 1,260 years later that the papacy's power would be taken away in what month? In February of 1798. And so it was that in February of 1798, General Berthier, the general of Napoleon Bonaparte's armies, entered the city of Rome. More specifically, the Vatican City. He went into the Sistine Chapel, where the Pope was celebrating the anniversary of his coronation. He went up to where the Pope was seated on his throne. He removed him from his throne. He took off his triple crown. He removed his staff. He took his papal rings off of his fingers. And he said to him, "Your rule and dominion has come to an end." And the Pope was taken prisoner, where he died in France in the year 1799. Did something significant happen with the papacy in the year 1798, in February of 1798? Most certainly, yes. But now we need to look a little more closely at the description of the taking away of the power of the papacy. Let's go to Revelation chapter 13 and verse 10. Revelation chapter 13 and verse 10. This is at the end of the times and dividing of time, at the end of the 1260 years of the 42 months. Two things happened to the beast or the little horn, to the papacy. It says there in Revelation 13 verse 10, "He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. And he who kills with the sword must be" what? Must be killed with the sword. Let me ask you, did the Pope lead people into captivity? Yes. What was the punishment? The papacy was going to go into captivity. Did the papacy kill with the sword? It killed with the sword. So would the sword give the papacy its deadly wound? Absolutely. In other words, the correct understanding of the taking away of the power of the papacy depends on your understanding of the sword and of the captivity. If you understand how the papacy was wounded by the sword and how it went into captivity, you're going to be able to understand this prophecy. So let's talk, first of all, about the sword. What is the sword that wounded the papacy in 1798? Well, some people say it was the Bible, because there's a verse in the Bible that says that the sword is the Word of God. Let's read that verse, Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 17. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 17 tells us that the sword of the Spirit is the Word of God. It says there, the Apostle Paul is writing, "And take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God." So some people go to Revelation 13 and they say, see, the Apostle Paul says that the sword of the Spirit is the Word of God, so what wounded the papacy was the Word of God. But there's a huge problem when you come to interpret it that way. Let me ask you, did the papacy use the Bible to kill people? Did the papacy use the Bible to kill people? No, it didn't use the Bible to kill people. And so the prophecy says that the beast killed with the sword, and the same sword that it killed with was going to give it the deadly wound. The papacy did not kill with the Bible. So it cannot represent the Bible. Furthermore, Some have said, well, you know, the Protestant Reformation brought out the Bible, sola scriptura, and that gave the papacy its deadly wound. The problem is, Protestantism began in 1517. The deadly wound wasn't given until 1798. Furthermore, we're told that the papacy is taken captive. The papacy was not taken captive in 1517 with the Protestant Reformation. It was taken captive in 1798. So there's several reasons why this sword that wounded the beast, that the beast used to kill, cannot represent the Bible. So you say, well, Pastor Bohr, what does the sword represent? I need to explain that in the Bible, symbols are flexible. They do not always mean the same thing. You have to take into account the context. Let me ask you, what does a lion represent in the Bible? Can the lion represent Jesus? He's the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Can the lion represent the devil? He goes about as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. Can the lion represent the kingdom of Babylon? Yes, we notice that in Daniel 7. Can the lion represent Judah, the son of Jacob? Yes, Genesis 49 says he's like a lion. So every time you find the lion in the Bible doesn't mean the same thing. It can be flexible. Are you with me? Let me give you another example. What does leaven represent in the Bible? Immediately I hear the answer, oh, leaven represents sin. Yes, it does represent sin, but not always. Jesus gave a parable of the leaven. He says you put the leaven in the dough, and when you put the leaven in the dough grows. He was teaching that when the Holy Spirit is placed in the church grows. So leaven can represent the Holy Spirit. It can also represent sin, depending on the context in which the symbol appears. Are you with me or not? Let me give you one further example. Genesis chapter 6 speaks about the sons of God that had sexual relation with the daughters of men. Now, if you read most commentaries today, they're going to say that the sons of God were angels that came down from heaven, and they had sexual relations with human women. Those were the daughters of men. And they say the result were the giants, a hybrid, part angel and part human. That's what scholars believe today. They don't take into account the context. You know why they interpret it that way? Because in the book of Job it says the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the devil came among them. They say the sons of God there are clearly angels that come to present themselves before the Lord. So if sons of God in Job is angels, sons of God in Genesis must also be angels. The problem is they don't take into account the context. You see, in Genesis chapter 4, you have the genealogy of Cain. 3 wicked women are mentioned in the genealogy of Cain. Those are the daughters of men. Then in Genesis 5, you have the descendants of Seth. That's the righteous lineage. Those are the sons of God. And then in Genesis 6, 1 and 2, you have the sons of God going into the daughters of men. In other words, the righteous intermingled with the unrighteous, according to the context. So sons of God doesn't always mean angels. It means so in Job, but it doesn't mean so in Genesis. And by the way, the Bible says that we are all sons of God, and none of us look like angels. So sons of God can also represent the righteous today, according to the Bible. So the sword can represent the Bible, but not in Revelation 13, because in Revelation 13, that definition does not fit. Are you with me or not? So the big question is, what does the sword represent? There is a second passage in the Bible that tells us what the second sword is. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 4. Romans chapter 13 and verses 1 through 4. It says there, speaking about the civil power, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Who are the authorities that are being spoken of in this verse? The civil power, the government, right? Verse 2, therefore whoever resists the authority, that is the government, resists the ordinance of God. And those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers, see, there it's defined, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? In other words, do you want to not fear the government? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he, that is the civil power, is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear what? Ah, there it is. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Let me ask you, does the civil power also have a sword? To whom does the sword of the Spirit belong? To whom does the word of God belong? Who is supposed to use it? The church. And how does the church use it? By preaching. I'm using the sword right now. That's how the church uses the sword, is by preaching the word of God. Let me ask you, does the word of God belong, does that sword belong to the civil power? No. How does the civil power use the sword? Well, if somebody disobeys the civil laws, the legitimate civil laws, can they be imposed a fine? Absolutely. Can they be given community service? Absolutely. Can their goods be confiscated? Yes. Can they be imprisoned? And in some states, can they be executed? Absolutely. That's how the civil power uses the sword. When you disobey the civil power uses the sword to punish you. Now you're following me now. Now let me ask you this. What sword did the papacy use during the 1260 years to destroy and to kill God's people? All you have to do is read history, folks. The papacy is not only a church, it is a state. And it had dominion over all of the civil powers, all of the states in Europe. Whenever the Pope asked a nation in Europe to persecute those who disagreed with the church, the civil power went along. In other words, the sword of the state was used by the papacy to what? To persecute. Let me ask you, did the civil power of France rise against the papacy and say, you're not going to use us anymore? Absolutely. So in 1798, France, which by the way is the first power that gave the papacy the sword, Clovis, king of the Franks. France is called the eldest daughter of the papacy. First gave the papacy the sword, and that same nation in 1798 said, you're not going to use the sword anymore. Took the sword away and gave the deadly wound to the papacy. Now we need to understand something very important, folks, and that is that the word papacy does not refer to the Roman Catholic Church as a church. The word papacy defines the Roman Catholic Church as a church and a state. The ability of the papacy to use the states of the world to accomplish their purposes. That's papacy. So just the church aspect of Roman Catholicism is not the papacy. It's when the papacy can use the civil powers of the world that you have papacy. Are you with me or not? Let me ask you, in 1798, when the papacy received the deadly wound, were the doors of all the Roman Catholic churches closed? Did people still attend church? Were the babies still baptized? Did people still go to the confessional? Did people still participate of the host in the communion service? Sure. The churches did not shut down. The deadly wound does not mean that the Roman Catholic Church as a church was going to cease to function. What it means is that the state portion, the ability to use the state, was taken away. And the state gave the papacy the deadly wound with the sword of civil power. Raise your hand if you're understanding what I'm saying, what the word papacy means. Now let me read you some statements from historians. Historians understood this. Here's one. The papacy was extinct. This is talking about what happened in 1798. The papacy was extinct. Was the church extinct? No. This historian knows that the church still existed. But it's the papacy, he says, that was extinct. Not a vestige of its existence remained. And among all the Roman Catholic powers, not a finger was stirred in its defense. If this had happened during the Middle Ages and the papacy was attacked, all of the nations would have ganged up on the power that attacked the papacy. But now this historian is saying not any nation lifted a finger to defend the papacy. This historian continues writing, the eternal city had no longer prince or pontiff. Its bishop was dying captive in foreign lands. And the decree was already announced that no successor would be allowed in its place. Another historian says, no wonder that half of Europe thought Napoleon's veto would be obeyed. Napoleon's veto was that there would be no more popes elected. So no wonder that half of Europe thought Napoleon's veto would be obeyed, and that with the Pope, the papacy was dead. Not the church. The papacy was dead. Interesting that a historian would describe the papacy as being what? dead because it received a deadly wound. Another historian says, multitudes imagined that the papacy was at the point of what? Of death, and asked, would Pius VI be the last pontiff, and if the close of the 18th century would be signalized by the fall of the papal dynasty. One further quotation, actually two. Here's another historian. The papacy had suffered its deepest humiliation and appeared to be what? Annihilated. The revolution, that's the French Revolution. By the way, the deadly wound was the culmination of the French Revolution. The revolution also dealt it the wound, interesting, the wound, which it seemed did not want to heal until far into what? The 20th century. One further quotation, the object of the French Directory was the destruction of the pontifical government. Not the church, by the way, but the pontifical government, as the irreconcilable enemy of the Republic. The aged Pope, that's Pius VI, was summoned to surrender the temporal government. See, he could no longer be a temporal ruler. No longer would he have a state. So it says he was summoned to surrender the temporal government. On his refusal, he was dragged from the altar, his rings were torn from his fingers, and finally, after declaring the temporal power abolished, the victors carried the Pope prisoner into Tuscany, where he never returned. So do you understand what the deadly wound with the sword is? But now we need to talk about the captivity. What does it mean when it says that the papacy led into captivity and the papacy would be taken into captivity? You know, usually, even in Seventh-day Adventist circles, you'll find that they'll say, well, you know, the captivity was fulfilled when Pope Pius VI was taken prisoner where he died in France. But there's something broader than this, because the deadly wound is not something that is given to an individual pope. The deadly wound is given to the beast. And the beast ruled for 1,260 years. In other words, the captivity and the wound is given to the entire system. Taking Pope Pius VI prisoner only culminated what had already existed for 1,260 years. In other words, we are to understand that the deadly wound and the captivity is not the deadly wound and a captivity of a singular pope, but of the entire system of the papacy. Are you with me or not? Now, how do we understand the captivity? Listen, it's very simple. As long as the papacy is able to use the civil powers of the world, the papacy is free. When the civil powers of the world withdraw their support, the papacy is in captivity. Are you following me or not? Now, you say, how do you know that from the Bible? Well, it's very simple. The book of Revelation explains itself. The closest parallel to this idea of captivity and being released from captivity is found in Revelation chapter 20. Let me ask you, is the devil today very active in the world, fulfilling his purposes and his will? If you say no, you must have been in a coma the last several years. Now, let me ask you, where does the power of the devil reside? It resides in being able to use the rulers of the world to accomplish his purposes. Let me give you an example. The dragon stood next to the woman to devour her child as soon as the child was born. Did the devil personally stand next to Mary when Jesus was going to be born? Of course not. How did he seek to accomplish his purpose of slaying Christ? Through a political ruler. Is the same true with the death of Christ? Did the devil use Pontius Pilate to doom and condemn Christ? Did he use Pharaoh to try and destroy Moses? Yes. See, the devil accomplishes his purpose by using the civil powers of the world. So when he uses the civil powers of the world, he is free and he is well. But what would happen, let me ask you, is the time coming when the devil is going to get a deadly wound and the devil is going to be sent into captivity? Yes. Where is that described? In Revelation 20. What's going to happen when Jesus comes with all of the support base of Satan? What's going to happen with all of the kings that he used to accomplish his purposes? They are all going to die at the second coming of Christ. So what's going to happen to the devil? The Bible says that an angel descends from heaven, and what does he have? He has a chain in his hand, and he is going to send the devil into what? Into prison, it says there. In other words, he is going to be imprisoned. Why is the devil imprisoned? Because he doesn't have any rulers through whom he can accomplish his purposes. So when he's able to use the kings, he's free. When he's not able to use the kings, he's captive. Are you with me or not? But when Jesus returns after the millennium, which is known as the third coming, the Bible says that Satan is going to be what? Released from his prison. Why? Because all of the kings that he used are going to what? They are going to resurrect, the Bible says. Will he have his power back? Will his wound be healed? Yes. Are you following me? So let me ask you, what does the captivity of the papacy mean? Folks, it simply means that the civil powers of the world withdrew their support and the papacy could not use them anymore. So the papacy, if they can't use the civil power, if the papacy can't use the kings of the world, the papacy is what? Wounded. It's in prison. So let me ask you, what would the healing of the deadly wound and the releasing from the captivity be? It must be that the sword of civil power will be restored to the papacy, and the civil powers will once again support the papacy. Are you following me or not? The healing of the deadly wound simply means that the civil powers of the world will once again give the papacy the support that they took away a little over 200 years ago. Is this making sense? So how important is it to understand the sword and to understand the captivity? You cannot understand this prophecy, you cannot understand the deadly wound of the papacy unless you understand what the wound is and what the sword is, and the captivity. Now let me read you some statements from a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church. He was a convert from the Anglican Church. This is in the mid-1800s. Cardinal Edward Henry Manning. He wrote a very interesting book, The Temporal Power of the Vicar of Jesus Christ. And I want to read several statements here where he actually is saying what I'm saying. But he doesn't realize that he's commenting on Revelation 13. Obviously, if he had really stopped to reflect about this, he might not have written what I'm going to read now. But anyway, he has several statements. Let me read them. Now, the abandonment of Rome. And let me explain what that means. You remember that Constantine moved the seat of the empire to Constantinople, and he left the throne vacant in the Western Roman Empire? You remember also that the last Roman emperor was deposed in the year 476. After that, there was no emperor in the Western Roman Empire. So that's what it means, the abandonment of Rome. There was no longer any civil ruler in Rome. So now who takes over the throne of civil rulership? The Pope does. Listen to what it says. Now the abandonment of Rome was the what? So if he needed to be liberated, he must have been, when there was an emperor, he must have been what? He must have been captive or bound. Are you with me or not? So now the abandonment of Rome was the liberation of the pontiffs, that is of the popes. Whatsoever claims to obedience the emperors may have made, and whatsoever compliance the pontiff may have yielded, the whole previous relation, anomalous and annulled again and again by the vices and outrages of the emperors, was finally dissolved by a higher power. Listen carefully now. The providence of God, I would question that. The providence of God permitted a succession of eruptions. Here he speaks about the barbarian invasions. Gothic, Lombard, and Hungarian to do what? To desolate Italy and to efface from it every remnant of the empire. And when this happened, what occurred? The pontiffs found themselves what? Alone. The sole, that means the only fountains of order, peace, law, and safety. And from that hour of this providential, here's the word again, this providential what? Liberation. When the emperor is gone, from the hour of this providential liberation, when by a divine intervention, listen to this now, the what? Oh, so he was chained before when he couldn't use the civil ruler, when he couldn't rule in civil matters. It says the chains fell off from the hands of the successor of Peter, as once before his own, no sovereign has ever reigned in Rome except the vicar of Jesus Christ. Are you catching the picture? Notice this next quotation from the same book. The papacy waited until such a time as God should break its what? There's the captivity again. Break its bonds asunder. And should, what's the next word? Liberate it. What did it need to be liberated from? Liberated from subjection to civil powers. Is the papacy today subject to civil powers? Is it able to use the civil powers like it did in the past? Not yet, but we're getting there. So it says the papacy waited until such a time as God should break its bonds asunder and should liberate it from subjection to civil powers and what? And enthrone it in the possession of a temporal sovereignty of its own. Here's another one. I say then that it was God's own act which liberated, notice against the word, liberated his vicar upon earth from subjection to temporal power. So when the papacy is not subject to temporal power, the papacy is what? Free. But when it is subject to the temporal power, like if there's a Caesar or if there's an emperor on the throne, then the papacy is what? It is captive or restrained. So it says, I say then that it was God's own act which liberated his vicar upon earth from subjection to temporal power. And now notice the time period that he says this happened. And that for 1,200 years, the bishops of Rome have reigned as temporal princes. Does that sound pretty close to 1260? Here's a Roman Catholic cardinal that is admitting that it was at least 1,200 years that this happened. Notice the next statement. The conversion of the empire to Christianity, and then its removal. That's when Constantine took the seat of the empire to the east. Its banishment into the far east, freed. So if he's freed, what happened before? He was bound, or he was captive. Freed the vicar of Jesus Christ from what? There it is, from temporal subjection. And then, by the action of the same providence, he was clothed with the prerogatives of a true and proper local sovereignty over that state and territory, and people so committed to his charge. From that hour, which I might say was 1,500 years ago, or, to speak within limit, I will say was 1,200, there it is again, the Supreme Pontiff has been a true and proper sovereign, exercising the prerogatives of royalty committed to him by the will of God over the people, to whom he is Father in all things, both what? Spiritual and temporal, church and state. Aren't these really telling statements? He doesn't realize that he's describing the freeing of the papacy when there was no longer an emperor, and the binding of the papacy in 1798 when the civil power said, you can't use us anymore. Amazing. Now there's something that is not mentioned in Daniel chapter 7 that is mentioned in Revelation 13. And that is, in Daniel chapter 7, this fourth beast has only 3 periods of dominion, 3 explicit periods of dominions. You have the fourth beast by itself, the Roman Empire. Then you have the 10 horns that sprout from its head. That's the divided Roman Empire. Then you have papal Rome ruling for 1,260 years. But the prophecy seems to end there in Daniel 7. It does hint that the little horn will be around when Jesus comes, because it says there that it'll be destroyed when Jesus comes. So it's understood that the little horn is going to be around the time of the second coming. But another stage of the little horn is not explicit in Daniel 7, but it is explicit in Revelation 13. Let me ask you, do you think the time is coming when the papacy is going to recover its freedom and is going to be healed from its deadly wound? Have you been observing what is happening in the world today? Have you been observing what is happening in the United States today in its links and its connections with the papacy? Let me just read from the book of Revelation what we are told about the last stage of this little horn. It's the fourth stage of this fourth beast. First, the United Roman Empire. After the United Roman Empire, then you have the divided Roman Empire. Then you have the papacy ruling 1,260 years, a period during which it is wounded and in captivity, and then its deadly wound is what? Is healed, and it will do in the future what it did in the past. You say, is that in the Bible? Yes. Go with me to Revelation 13 and verse 3. Speaking about the beast It says, and I saw one of his heads as if it had been what? Mortally wounded. Now comes the rest of the story. And his deadly wound was healed. Is the beast going to recover its power? What would the healing of the wound be? Well, it must be that it can use the civil power again. What does it mean that is it going to be freed from captivity? Yeah, because it's going to be able to use the civil powers once again. See, it's very simple. So it says, and his deadly wound was healed, and all of Fresno too. It says, and all the world, what? Marveled and followed the beast. Is the whole world going to follow the beast? According to this, yes. How many Protestants believe this? Protestants have forsaken this method of interpreting Bible prophecy. Therefore, the great leaders of Protestantism, such as Joel Osteen, Rick Warren, Kenneth Copeland, etc., have made trips to Rome and have spoken gloriously about the Roman Catholic system. If they understood this prophecy, if they understood that the papacy is the little horn of the beast, would they be doing that? No. They've thrown away the method, the chain method, where you can follow the sequence of powers, one link after another, and therefore they cannot see the dangers of this system that ruled in the past. And therefore they will be caught in the snare. And they will wake up only when it is too late to escape from the snare. Who is going to tell them this? Listen, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the only church in the world that uses this method today. The Protestant Reformers used it. If Martin Luther and John Calvin resurrected today, they would die of a heart attack because they would not recognize the churches that came as a result of them. Because Luther and Calvin, they believed the papacy was the Antichrist. But today, apart from Adventists, hardly anybody believes that. Now, what is the next link in the chain? Who will restore the power of the sword and deliver the papacy from its imprisonment? Folks, this is the most unbelievable part of this prophecy. It is going to be the most unlikely power in the world that will restore the sword to the papacy, and the whole world will follow the example of this nation. And you say, what nation in its right mind would do this? Restore freedom to the papacy and restore the sword to the papacy. The most unlikely of all nations. And I like to say this, that nation is the elephant in the room. Everybody can see it, but at the same time, they can't see it. So don't miss the next exciting episode.